Lesson 36. The sufferings of birth and death are nirvana. In this half of the Bônnô soku Bodai principle, one concept occupies a special place, nirvana. Before studying it, a look back at the origin of Buddhism and the first teachings of the Buddha is necessary. Buddhism, pro-Memoria, was born from compassion, from the desire of a prince who had broken lies with his royal life to put an end to the sufferings of birth and death. At the origin of Buddhism, compassion, the desire to put an end to the sufferings of birth and death. A brief look back at the life of the Buddha will help us better understand why he professed the Four Noble Truths. A brief look back at the life of the Buddha. It was following his four encounters: illness, old age, death, wandering monk, outside the family cocoon, that the young crown prince, Siddhartha Gautama, renounced the world. After a dozen years of ascetic practices and eremitic existence, he achieved enlightenment. Discovering himself as a doctor of civilization, he took the name of Shakyamuni, namely the wise man of the Shakya tribe, in Sanskrit. His first sermon, The Four Noble Truths, delivered in Benares in the surf park, constitutes the heart of this half of the Shoji Sakunohan principle. The Four Noble Truths. The defining features of the Four Noble Truths. These are: 1. Life is suffering. 2. Suffering is linked to the small self, selfish desire. 3. The extinction of selfish desire leads to the cessation of suffering. 4. There is a path that leads to the extinction of this suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path. Deciphering the Four Noble Truths. The objective of the Four Noble Truths: to awaken the Sangha to the impermanence of nature. Everything changes, nothing is constant, such is the law of birth and death. This formula sums up the Buddha's first oath quite well. Through the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha awakened the minds of his disciples to the impermanence of nature. This negative perception of human existence, of nature, professed by the Buddha was, in reality, aimed at leading his disciples to turn away from attachments to changing things, to arouse their spirit of research. Of Nichiren's reflection on the impermanence of nature, Nichiren Daishonin, in his letter to Naik, edifies us on this transience of the human condition, how quickly the days flee. Seeing them pass by, we understand the brevity of the moments that remain to us. The friends with whom we enjoyed, on spring mornings, the joy of admiring the cherry blossoms, are they no more? They have been carried away like petals by the winds of impermanence, leaving behind only their names. Even if the cherry trees will bloom again. But when and in what world will the departed beings be reborn? The Four Noble Truths, reinforced by verses of sutras. The Four Noble Truths teach us that regardless of any social consideration, human beings are prey to the sufferings of birth and death. This is because of the ephemeral nature of life. The Venerable Shakyamuni presented in chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra as similar to an experienced physician, who used inopportune means to cure his children, after having made the diagnosis of the ills from which humanity suffers, proposes the remedy, the Noble Eightfold Path leading to Nirvana. The problem of Nirvana, in Buddhism. Nirvana, this Sanskrit concept whose definition is essential, is the ultimate goal of practice in Hinayana, when for Mahayana, it constitutes one of the stages in the awakening of a state of supreme happiness and wisdom. Of the meaning of Nirvana: Nirvana is a Sanskrit term referring to extinction, emancipation, or non-rebirth. Nirvana is a state where the five aggregates disintegrate and cannot reproduce themselves anywhere. More prosaically, nirvana is a state or absence of state in which both earthly illusions and desires as well as samsara are definitively extinguished. Depending on whether one is in the Hinayana or from the Mahayana point of view, nirvana has different conceptions. Nirvana, the ultimate goal of practice in the Hinayana, the wisdom of the Hinayana, the goal of practice in Theravada in the Andi-Lotusic teachings, notably in Tahanya, prior to the Wisdom Sutras, nirvana is the ultimate goal of Buddhist practice. This perception of nirvana continues to exist in Theravada or Hinayana. In Hinayana, a small vehicle, although having an infra-Buddhist wisdom, inferior to Buddhist wisdom, the arhat, a person having erased all illusions, in Sanskrit, is considered as the ultimate spiritual progression. In Hinayana Buddhism, observing the Buddhist octologue or 8 righteousnesses was supposed to allow practitioners to free themselves from the sufferings of birth and death. This practice, as we know, is very elitist, exclusionist, solitary. The President explains it. Moreover, shortcomings of the Theravada doctrine highlighted by President Ikeda. President Ikeda stigmatizes Hinayana as follows: the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Noble Path were mainly intended for disciples who had rejected secular life and had fully engaged in Buddhist practice. They reflect the approach specific to the first teachings, centered on an essentially negative perception of life and the world, so that human beings would first awaken to the harsh realities of existence, then to the unspeakable spiritual experience of Nirvana. The other type of great insufficiency of Hinayana. One of the major insufficiencies of Hinayana lies in its assertion that Nirvana can only be attained at the moment of death. This conception of Nirvana was violently shot down by the proponents of Mahayana, who described it as a teaching aimed at reducing the body to ashes and annihilating consciousness. Nirvana, awakening to a state of supreme happiness and wisdom. In Mahayana, the Buddha, as a good teacher, after having awakened his disciples to the existence of suffering and the means of attaining Nirvana, the end of suffering, refutes this teaching. In reality, this teaching aimed at understanding a greater teaching, the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is a fundamental refutation of the Flower Garland Sutra. However, certain Mahayana schools have developed another conception of Nirvana. Non-Lotus conceptions of Nirvana, false conceptions of Nirvana. Some Mahayana schools, although not perceiving Nirvana as extinction and considering Hinayana as an escape from the phenomenal world, have an anti-Lotus conception of Nirvana. In the representations of these schools, Nirvana can only be attained after many existences of Buddhist practice, after having succeeded in eliminating the two darknesses. Sometimes, it is perceived as an extraterrestrial paradise, confer philosophy of Amitism. The Lotus Sutra, the Sutra of the True Essence. I seem to enter Nirvana, but this is only an expedient means. In truth, I do not enter extinction. I am still here preaching the law. In Chapter 16 Juryo, Duration of the Buddha's Life, of the Lotus Sutra, founder of the true Mahayana, of the definitive Mahayana, the Buddha, as we see, refutes the notion of Nirvana. For the Lotus Sutra, there is no other Nirvana than real life. The Daishonen's deepening of the principle in Japan, this principle renamed Soju Soku no Han, was deepened by the Daishonin. If you wish to put an end to the beginningless cycle of births and deaths and absolutely attain supreme enlightenment in this life, you must perceive the marvelous principle inherent in all living beings, Myoho Renge Kyo, on the attainment of Buddhahood in this life. In short, it is by awakening, or better by adopting Nam Myoho Renge Kyo, that through the pains and joys of life, one can reach Nirvana. Nirvana, in the teachings of the Daishonin, is nothing other than the attainment of Buddhahood. Ultimately, since the teaching of the Lotus Sutra, in particular the profession of Chapter 16, Juryo, Duration of the Life of the Buddha, the extracts of which have previously been exposed, no longer truly exists. It should therefore be removed from the Buddhist lexicon. But we will not do so. We will consider it as a synonym for Buddhahood.